Well, good evening to all of you. Let me add my welcome to Biff's. And Biff, that was awesome. Thanks so much for being a part of this on Wednesday nights. And we're glad you're tuning in if you're watching live stream, or I know that many of you are watching later on video, maybe on YouTube or on the Highline Community Church's media site. So whether you're live with us or watching downline a little bit, we're glad that you are here. This is session 17 of our study in the book of Revelation. So if you happen to be just jumping in, know that all of the rest of those sessions are available online. Again, you can go to the Highline Community Church website and under media, or you can go directly to YouTube. And we have a YouTube channel called the Telos Project, which is a nonprofit that I run, and everything that we've done so far on video is available there, thanks to my son Baker. So tonight on this session 17, we have got a lot of turf to cover. We've had weeks where we've only covered a couple of verses. Tonight we're actually going to cover about 2.5 chapters of the book because they all tie together. And they are relatively short chapters, but some scholars actually say that they are the hardest chapters and images to know how to translate in the whole book. If you're Catholic, you might be aware of one of the what are called the doctors of the church, some of the early church fathers, one particular named Saint Jerome. And I ran across a couple of quotes about Revelation from Saint Jerome. This is actually Michelangelo's portrait of him. And he seems to always be painted with a skull because one of his favorite pieces of advice was think about death, the mortality. And so oftentimes you'll see a skull there. But one of the things that he said was that there are 7 ways to interpret the book of Revelation, and which is what makes it so extremely difficult. We've touched upon the 4 primary ways, and I tend to weave those in a bit. But the other thing that he said is that there are multiple meanings in every word of the text. So it makes it hard to try and get our arms around Revelation, but we're kind of coming in at least a pretty basic level and trying to help you get a feel for that. By the way, what Jerome is famous for, he was a genius, and what he is famous for is he was the first scholar to take the Hebrew Old Testament and translate it into Latin. He translated the entire Bible. It was called the Vulgate, and really for many centuries it was the official Bible of the church. So he was quite a guy. All right, we're with John, and we're in visionary form. We've been caught up with him into heaven. And where we are in our part of the process here, the text, Jesus has just opened a series of seals upon a scroll that contains God's plans and purposes for the future of humanity and the universe. And last week we saw as he opened the 7th seal, 7 angels came forth that stand in the presence of God. These are the archangels, and to each of them was given a trumpet. And what's going to happen then, we saw, is that as each angel sounds the trumpet in heaven, something happens on earth having to do with God's redemption of the planet, really reclamation of the planet, which is what's going on during this tribulation period. We hit 4 of them last week real quickly. Trumpet number 1, when it was blown, there was fire and hail and blood, and 1/3 of the earth's vegetation was destroyed. And trumpet number 2, a blazing mountain fell into the sea and polluted the seas and killed the sea creatures and damaged the ships. The 3rd trumpet was sounded, and another blazing object comes from the sky. Probably both of those, perhaps, if this is literalistic, being meteors, but this one hits the freshwater sources, and because it's called wormwood, meaning poisonous, a third of the freshwater sources become polluted. And then the fourth trumpet, we aren't really told exactly the source other than God just cuts off a third of the light of the sun and the moon and the stars, and so there's a darkness that begins to set in, and again, 1/3 of the light is cut back. Whether this is literal or symbolic, of course, will continue to be one of the critical questions as we go through the book. Is this physical destruction that we're seeing, or as Jerome was saying, that there are so many levels to the book of Revelation, or is this a way that John is visualizing something that has to do more with spiritual deception and destruction? We also have kind of looked at one of the views that believes that actually all of this took place in the first century, and that the real theme of the book is the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't personally hold to that view, but so far that particular view would say that everything that we've seen so far in the book is leading up to the actual physical destruction of Jerusalem. And then after that fourth trumpet, we're told that John, he sees an eagle flying in the sky, and in a loud voice this eagle is crying out, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other three angels." And so now the last three trumpets are oftentimes called the woe judgments, and that word woe was oftentimes used to introduce a prophetic message of God's judgment. So that's where we pick up tonight. We really pick up with the first woe, which is actually then the fifth trumpet. And we read this: "The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss." Let me go back before I go on and kind of tell you a little bit about what's going on here. The source of what we're getting ready to see is going to be the unleashing of just a horde of demonic beings from this place called the abyss. The abyss was the place where fallen angelic beings were being held until the time of the judgment. It was a word that was used sometimes synonymously with the word Sheol, which again was the place where the dead in sort of the Hebrew understanding of the world and the universe, that down under the earth was this place where the departed would go, awaiting the time of judgment. It also might be, and was used parallel with the word Tartarus, which shows up in 2 Peter. And kind of, again, I wouldn't call it mysterious, but certainly a kind of a wild statement that Peter makes, just kind of off the cuff as he's talking about another subject. He says, "For if God didn't spare angels when they sinned, but sent them," and the New International Version translates hell, but the word that appears there is Tartarus. And again, that was a prison, a place where fallen angels were kept, putting them in chains of darkness, gloomy dungeons is one translation, to be held for judgment. And so what we see here is this release of this horde of demonic locusts. And here's what he says: "When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it, like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. And out of the smoke, locusts came down on the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree," which a physical locust, that's exactly what they would have done. So they were told not to harm them, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And so they're sent out, and they're sent out to torment these demonic locusts. And those that they are sent to torment are, again, humans that have not received the seal of the living God. And we've talked about that a couple of weeks ago and what that all entailed. They're given a 5-month period where they are going to torture unsealed human beings. 5 months, by the way, was the literal lifespan of a locust, but obviously these aren't just regular locusts. When we go on in the text, we read this: they were not allowed to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes. And during those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. And so, and then we get a description of what they looked like. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. Their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. So there's this release of these demonic beings, and again, whether it's literally that's what we would see, that we would see these creatures that are described in this manner, or whether it is symbolic, again, of simply the release of demonic beings. It goes back to that idea we've talked about a little bit before, that even in the midst of the world in which we live, where there is so much tragedy and difficulty and pain and suffering, yet and evil, God is restraining that so that we are not experiencing sort of the full impact of what would be happening in our world were there not a restrainer in place. But the time comes when God removes the restrainer. We saw that when we looked at the first of the opening of the seals, and how somehow that the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, he's being held back. And then when the restrainer is removed, he comes forward and he's revealed. Well, in the same way, it's as if that even though there's demonic activity in the world today, God is restraining that. And then you get to this trumpet, and it's as if restraint is removed from the demonic, and the result is that people are basically tortured. And again, whether it is a literal, actual creature that is doing this, or whether it's a symbol again, and that John perhaps what is happening is that John is seeing the unseen. We don't see demons and their activity with our physical eyes, but John here is seeing that. So even if it's symbolic, we're getting this sense of the sort of the horrid nature of the demonic. And then it goes on, and he says this: they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails with stingers like scorpions, and in their tails they had power to torment people for 5 months. And they had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon. Abaddon means destruction in Hebrew, and Apollyon means the destroyer in Greek. And there's a degree of debate as to who is this king over the abyss. And many of the scholars believe that this actually is Satan himself. because of some of the description of what happens here. If it's not Satan, then it would be demons of an incredibly high order. And when people talk about the possibility of it being Satan himself, it's interesting because this whole concept of how that the demonic is so destructive. And you go back to John chapter 10, it's a famous passage, but usually the first half of the verse isn't quoted, and this is the first half of the verse. The thief, and Jesus is making a reference there to the devil, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. And so this idea of destruction ties in here to Revelation. And then I wanted to throw in the second half of the verse because it's a great statement about the difference between the evil one and Christ. So Christ says, in contrast to that, I've come that they might have life and have it to the full. And so we have this, release then going on. Again, very difficult to determine exactly whether it is literal or symbolic. It's interesting because there are at least two other major passages in the Scriptures where there is a reference to the demonic. This is one artist's conception of what those demonic beings out of the abyss might have looked at. There was the plague of the locusts in Egypt at the time of Moses, and of course those were literal locusts that devastated the land. And then in the book of Joel, he makes reference to a locust invasion, and really scholars aren't sure whether he's referring to physical locusts or if he uses that as a symbol of an invading army that simply destroys everything in its path. But what we do know, literal or symbolic, is that when this trumpet sounds, there is an unleashing of demonic activity. We talk periodically, by the way, about some futurists, and we're taking that perspective. Some futurists actually work very hard at identifying things in Revelation and how they might represent, specific things here during our time. And of course, Hal Lindsey and others believe that perhaps that this is all having to do with some kind of a nuclear exchange, and that some of the poisoning is coming from the fallout of the nuclear exchange. But in this particular passage, Hal Lindsey says that perhaps what John is seeing, he's actually seeing Cobra helicopters, and that he's seeing something technologically that he wouldn't have any ability to describe, but the sound of a helicopter, like a chariot moving, and the fire that would come out of their mouths and their tails stinging. And again, that's just one actually small school of thought when it gets that literalistic. But what we do read, though, is that then after those 5 months where people are tortured demonically and yet are not allowed to die, that is the first woe, and that the first woe is past. It brings us then to the second woe in the sixth trumpet. We read this. The sixth angel sounded his trumpet, and I heard a voice coming from the four horns of the golden altar that's before God. It said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Let me give you a little geographical view here. If you look at the map, you can obviously see where the Euphrates River is, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and today the Euphrates just about divides in half modern-day Iraq. To the far side of the Euphrates, on the other side of the Tigris, we're going to see that where the nation of Iran is, but it's as if God has put a barrier here on the Euphrates River. And by the way, something that many people don't realize when they talk about the land promised to Abraham, we tend to think about modern day Israel and the Holy Land, which is very small. The promise was all the way to the river, and that would have been a reference to the Euphrates, so that the landmass that you see there in between the Mediterranean and Euphrates, all of that was really promised to Abraham. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to give you an expanded view so you can see what is to the east of the Euphrates. And what we see beginning there with Iran is that we have Iran, we have China, India is in there. And what's going to happen now is that barrier that has been put in place, in a sense, nothing you could see but a spiritual barrier, these angels are told now to release the armies that are beyond the river. And again, we think that perhaps that if it's literal, it would be the largest army that the world has ever seen. Coming from the east, and this is going to tie in a little later with what's called the sixth bowl, which is actually the Battle of Armageddon. And so it's as if now these forces are mobilizing and getting ready to head toward the Holy Land. At a point in time, the Euphrates is going to be dried up so that the army would be able to cross it as if it wasn't even there. And the number that is given of mounted, so you got mounted troops, the object, Israel, probably, ultimately Armageddon, and that ultimately, whether it's at this point or later on when the bowl judgments take place, is that a third of humanity is going to die. And so again, we read, and the four angels who'd been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of the mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. And if you put that all together, that means that somehow or other, this would be an army, if it's literal, of 200 million soldiers. And by the way, at the time that the book of Revelation was written, that was not far off from the actual population of the entire world. So this was a massive army, but in the days in which we live, and we don't know exactly who these kings of the east will be, that again a little later on we're going to be seeing as we move toward the Battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. But for years people thought it was China, and China actually has boasted that when it mobilizes its reserves, it can put on the field an army of 200 million men, the exact figure from Revelation. My sense is that perhaps Iran and China there might be something together, but you just have this unbelievably large army that has been restrained and is now going to be released and ultimately to march on the Holy Land toward the Mount of Megiddo, which is what Har-Megiddo or Armageddon means. And again, we'll see more of that in the sixth bowl. The interesting thing about this particular trumpet is we again are given a sense of, well, what's humanity's response to what's going on, this unleashing of torturous, demonic creatures. And again, if we didn't see them, if this was symbolic, and it was demons, not these kind of locusts that you see, I mean, people would be going crazy. The world would get completely insane. And yet, what we're told is this. I'm going to go on for just a section here. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues still did not repent of the work of their hands. They didn't stop worshiping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, idols that cannot see, hear, or walk, nor did they repent of their murders, their magic arts, their sexual immorality, or their thefts. And what we see here again is this sense that perhaps part of what's going on, at least in the early stages of the tribulation period, is God is really hoping that people will turn to Him, and that the sort of the cataclysmic nature of what's going on would help turn their hearts. But at this point, we're seeing that's just not happening. They're not repenting, and I think the takeaway from that is that at the point in time that this is taking place, whether it's in our lifetime, whether it's in, maybe we're upon it even now, things could happen so quickly, or if it's down line, is that there comes a time, much like what happened prior to the flood, where humanity reaches a point where they are literally unsalvageable. And when that happens, God in His mercy steps in and judges. Back at the time of the flood, in Genesis 6:5, we were told that the state of the world was that every inclination of man's heart was always evil continually. And that's a pretty good way of saying they were unsalvageable, and the result is that God used the flood. Now He uses the tribulation that we see here in the book of Revelation. So that's kind of our first takeaway. One more trumpet to sound, one final set of judgments. But before that happens, we have another one of these kind of interlude periods that we talked about. We saw it earlier in the seals when we had this parenthetical section of 144,000 being sealed with the seal of the living God, and then the vision of the great multitude before the throne. We're going to have a little section here where we're going to see a number of apocalyptic figures that are very symbolic in many ways prior to the what happens when that seventh trumpet is actually blown. The first is in chapter 10, and we're told this. John says, "Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He was robed in a cloud with a rainbow above his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars." We aren't exactly sure, is this a angelic being, or is it another way of describing Jesus? Because there's so many parallels between the description of this particular being and what we saw in chapter 1 of Jesus. So is this an angel, or is this Jesus? Well, we're told that this angel has something special, that in his hand he's holding another scroll. So we're inside the scroll that Jesus has opened by breaking all of the seals, but inside of the scroll now there is another scroll, and we're told this about it. This being, whether it's Jesus or an angel, was holding a little scroll which lay open in his hand. He planted his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and he gave a loud shout like the roar of a lion. And when he shouted, the voices of the seven thunders spoke. Now, we're going to get back to the scroll in a minute, but we've just been introduced to something that is baffling to most interpreters of Revelation. One of the reasons I think they say these are the perhaps two hardest chapters in the book to translate, and that is that John hears seven thunders speak. And then what happens is this: "And when the seven thunders spoke, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven say, 'Seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down.'" I think one of the things I like about this particular tiny little slice here in chapter 10 is it partially tells us we just don't know everything. that there are things that God has chosen to reveal to us, and there are things that He has chosen not to reveal. And all we can say is that whatever the seven thunders said that John was going to write down was something at this point in time, at least in the book of Revelation, that John is told not to reveal. And then we get back to the scroll. There will be no more delay, but in the days of when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished, just as He announced to His servants. And then the voice that I had heard from heaven spoke to me once more, "Go, take the scroll that lies open in the hand of the angel who's standing on the sea and on the land." And so I went to the angel and I asked him to give me the little scroll. And he said to me, "Take it and eat it. It will turn your stomach sour, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey." John is given what to most of us would probably seem like a pretty strange instruction. It would be like me handing you a book and saying, "Go eat this book." But it wasn't strange within the culture of John's day, particularly within the Jewish culture, because oftentimes this is how a prophetic message was given to a prophet. I just pulled one of them out. This same kind of language appears in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and in Zephaniah. But in Ezekiel, for instance, Ezekiel is told this, "Son of man, eat what is before you, eat this scroll. Then go and speak to the people of Israel." So I opened my mouth and He gave me the scroll to eat. So the image is that here's the word of God, and the prophet is to take that and to eat the scroll, and what's contained within the scroll will be the message then that the prophet speaks. And so here, a lot of debate about, well, what exactly is in this little scroll. For one thing, when he eats it, it's sweet to the taste, but it turns sour in his stomach. And I've always felt like that perhaps the sweetness is that the message of the scroll is what's contained in the rest of Revelation, which ultimately leads to the second coming of Christ, a new heavens, a new earth, a new Jerusalem, the old order of things passing away, a completely new order. All of that would be sweet. But what has to happen for that to take place, what we're going to see when the bowls of wrath are poured out, it sours John's stomach. It's tough stuff, what it's going to take to reclaim earth. So he eats the scroll, and I think he's told then, I took the little scroll from the angel's hand, ate it, tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I'd eaten it, my stomach turned sour. And then I was told, "You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings." And immediately it transitions us then into this next scene that again is parenthetical, but probably contained within this little scroll of what's something that's going to happen during this time period. And so we read this. "I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, 'Go and measure the temple of God and the altar with its worshipers, but exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will trample on the holy city for 42 months. So John is told to go measure the temple. Now, this is where things get kind of tricky, because if John is writing in 95 AD, there is no temple. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. As a matter of fact, those that hold to that theory that Revelation was all actually finished in the first century and was about the destruction of Jerusalem, well, this would be a verse they would point to. They would say, well, there has to be a temple for John to measure it. And so the question becomes, well, is he speaking about a literal temple here? Or is this even symbolic? Or in the end times, will there be a third temple? You know, today, if you go to Israel, you can see what's called the Temple Mount. And there on the Temple Mount are two Islamic holy places. There's the Dome of the Rock, which you see with the gold dome on top of it. And then kind of toward the bottom of the picture there's actually a mosque there called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And for years the debate has gone on, well, if there is going to be a third temple, how can that happen? Is the Dome of the Rock going to get destroyed? Is the Al-Aqsa Mosque going to get destroyed? And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that there's actually quite a bit of modern scholarship that is questioning whether that was the Temple Mount or not. And some of those that have researched it said that up until the 11th or 12th century, the time of the Crusades, that piece of real estate was not known as the Temple Mount, that was a later development, and that the temple itself, the location of the temple, would have been in the city of David, and that it would have been as much as like 40 meters or 40 yards south of what we call the Temple Mount. This is just one little illustration of what some of these scholars and archaeologists believe. They believe that what we consider the Temple Mount was actually the Antonia Fortress, and that it remained actually, or at least was maybe even rebuilt after the destruction of Jerusalem, because a Roman city was built on the site of Jerusalem, if you're not familiar with that, and that this is the exact dimensions of what it took to house a Roman legion. And that then they believe that what we think of as the Temple Mount was the home of the 10th Legion that was assigned to guard Jerusalem. And then, as you can see here on the drawing, that the actual temple site would have been to the south of that. And again, there's archaeological work going on right now in these areas, so that the possibility exists that actually a third temple could be built without doing anything to what is currently called the Temple Mount. But that's all, kind of speculative. But there's other places in the New Testament where it would seem that in the end times there's going to be a literal temple. 2 Thessalonians talks about it. Matthew chapter 24, Jesus talks again about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, which again is a reference to the temple. The final chapters of Ezekiel have measurements of the temple and the kind of millennial Holy Land. So, it could be literal that John is told to measure here. But it could be symbolic, because in Scripture, we're told that the church is the true temple, because the temple is the place where God dwells. And God really never intended to dwell in a building. From the beginning, God's desire was to dwell in human beings that He had created. And so twice in the book of Corinthians, we're told, don't you know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, that you actually are a temple? Interestingly, in one of those texts, you is singular, so it's a statement being made to individual believers, but in one of those, it's plural, addressing the whole church. Don't you know that you're the temple of God? And so it could be symbolic. Well, why is he called to measure it? Well, measuring had a number of purposes. One was to set something apart for God. Another was that sometimes things would be measured for preservation, other times for destruction. So the measuring of the, quote, temple here could be another way of saying what we saw back with 144,000, that God is saying that believers will be protected, They're not destined for God's wrath. They are going to be liable to martyrdom and persecution from the Antichrist, but it could simply be another way of this same message that God's going to do something to protect his people. So kind of a toss-up, whether it's literal or symbolic. But that then leads us into our last little piece that we want to look at today, which has to do with the next thing that John sees. God says to him, "And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are," quote, "the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and," quote, "they stand before the Lord of the earth." The 2 witnesses are another one of those baffling pieces here in this part of the book of Revelation. Are they 2 literal human beings? And there's a lot of speculation about that. Could this perhaps be Elijah and Moses? There's some, within Hebrew tradition, there are some that believe that Moses didn't die either. Elijah was caught up before he died. So was Enoch. So some think it'll be Elijah and Enoch. Others, Elijah and Moses. A lot of theories about who these 2 human beings might be, if in fact it's literal human beings. Now, the concept where God says these are the 2 olive trees and these are the 2 lampstands goes all the way back to the book of Zechariah again. And in Zechariah, he tells us this: "I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lamps on it, with 7 channels to the lamps. Also, there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left." And then God says this: "These are the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth." And in a sense, what John is saying is that prophecy back in Zechariah is now being fulfilled by these 2 witnesses. They will have a worldwide ministry in the end times, if this is literal. They will minister in great power for 1,260 days, which is 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Those numbers are going to be repeated over and over again in Revelation. And we don't know, is it the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period, or is it the last 3.5 years? But certainly they have a message, and it's a message of repentance and judgment. They're clothed in sackcloth, like an Old Testament prophet would be. And when we go on to read, we're told this: "Now when they finish their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them, and their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified." So at the end of their period of ministry, they're murdered in Jerusalem. And the whole world is going to see this. They lie in the public square, and we're told that that the world will rejoice that they've been killed. But then, after 3 days, the whole world will see this: "But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them. They stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, 'Come up here.' And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on." And I can just imagine, if it's all literal, it will be on 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper reporting live from Jerusalem, and the whole world will see it. You know, one of the things that struck me is, do you realize it's only been in the last 70 years, probably, where an event could take place that the whole world could see? Television is about 70 years old. Of course, the internet is newer than that. But we live in a time where an event like this could literally be seen by the whole world in a way that it really couldn't have prior to our own lifetime. But what if it's symbolic? What if it's not two literal human beings? If it's symbolic, then they represent the church again. And again, there is this theme that seems to flow through when we're trying to figure out literal or symbolic. And in the Old Testament, to have faithful testimony, you had to have two witnesses at least. And so this could be a symbol of the faithful and true witness of the church during this period of time. And lampstands and oil go back to chapter 1. And in chapter 1, the lampstands, Jesus said, what? They represented the church, and oil represented the Holy Spirit. And so this could be, again, a symbol of the church, empowered and protected to proclaim until they're finished, and going through great persecution and ultimately martyrdom by the Antichrist, but empowered. And by the way, we've talked a little bit about those that believe in a pre-trib rapture like Biff, and I hope he's right, that the church gets taken out of the world before the tribulation begins. And then we've talked about what I think is the case, that perhaps the church will go through this period and will be raptured at the end of it to return with Christ. That's called post-trib. But there's a third position back in session 10 we talked about, which is called the mid-trib position, which believes the church might go through the first 3.5 years, and then at that midpoint, when the seventh trumpet sounds, that then the church gets caught up and out of the world, and they look to this text. Because here again, when they've finished their ministry, and if it is the church, then the voice comes, "Come up here." And the same message that was given to John back in chapter 4. So just another one of the theories. And as we're looking at this, suddenly there's an earthquake. Part of the city of Jerusalem, the whole city begins to shake. Part of it trembles. Buildings begin falling. People get crushed. And then we're told finally the seventh angel steps forward and prepares to sound his trumpet, because at that very hour, that's the Jerusalem, the second woe is past. So again, what we've been seeing there was the second woe. Third woe is coming. The takeaway, the end, sometimes what I like to refer to as the beginning, we'll get into that, is near. And the seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, and you've got to get back next week to see what the voices in heaven said. Seventh trumpet. We're also going to be introduced to the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, kind of the unholy trinity. So hopefully hang in there with us. I know this is wild stuff, and hopefully it triggers your thinking process, and it'll give you some great discussion. So Biff, I'm going to have you come on up and give us the questions.
All right. Wow, there's a lot to digest tonight. I mean, this is like going to a steakhouse and just getting a meat overload. This is absolutely amazing. I mean, you bring up so many nuances in the construct of the woes. And so the first question for you and your discussion group tonight is, do you think the demonic horde is symbolic of real demons or an invading army? Let me repeat that question again. Do you think the demonic horde is symbolic of real demons or an invading army? I thought that was an interesting take you took on that. It was kind of a black creature that had kind of the face of a man, and then when you put it in the modern vernacular, it was a helicopter with a grill on it. The second question is, do you think another temple will be built in Israel? Do you think another temple will be built in Israel? And third, do you think the two witnesses are two people or a symbol of the church during the tribulation? Do you think the two witnesses are two people or a symbol of the church during the tribulation?